Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. And today we have quite a doozy for you. Today I want to talk about a book that I read, one that is about religion and prophets and preaching and those kinds of things. I am referring to The Violent Bear It Away by Flannery O'Connor, which was published in 1955, at least the first chapter, and sometime around 1960 for the entire book. I've talked about Flannery O'Connor on this channel before. When I talked about the story A Good Man is Hard to Find, definitely recommend that one out there. So I don't need to go into that much detail, but for those who don't know, Flannery O'Connor is an American writer who lived in the mid-1900s, from 1925 to 1965, died or thereabouts, died at a very young age, unfortunately. Flannery only got 2 books published, but what very interesting books they are, and a handful of short stories. She frequently wrote about religion and Southern Gothic kind of style stories, tragic characters, and unfortunate happenings, a lot which you see in the story that I'm going to be talking about today. Very well regarded for their work, even if their collective body isn't as extensive as other writers. But there's also, given that Flannery O'Connor is from the South, it makes sense that she'd be a little racist, and that kind of pops up in the story too. Although not nearly as unfortunate as H.G. Wells's book that I read pretty recently, that was much more overt, but still a little bit racist. And I'll be talking about The Violent Bear It Away. I picked it up from my local library, so don't forget to patronize your local libraries. But I'm also going to spoil it. I feel like it's kind of hard not to do that because it's kind of ingrained in the plot. But it's from a story that's 50 plus years old. So, if you're interested in not having it spoiled, because I am going to recommend it, I recommend that you go out there, read it, and then come back and finish this video. So without further ado, let's talk about The Violent Bear It Away. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Violent Bear It Away focuses on Francis Tarwater. He is an orphan raised by his uncle, his very religious uncle in Tennessee, sometime around the 1950s, 1960s. His uncle kidnapped him after his mother died in an accident because he was being raised by his other uncle, a school teacher named Rayber. But his religious uncle didn't think that he was going to get the religious upbringing that he needed, and he had also kidnapped Rayber at one point. So he just does that and raises Francis, who is somewhat skeptical of his uncle at times, but also believes very heavily in God and Jesus and all of that. Unfortunately, at the start of the story, his uncle dies when he's about 14, and his uncle has tasked him with burying his body, which Francis doesn't really want to do. He also is having a voice pop into his head. It's a bit ambiguous what that voice actually is, but I'll talk about that in the analysis section. But it's telling him not to bury the body, and that he doesn't have to go on believing what nonsense his uncle was preaching. Instead, Francis chooses to get drunk while other people tend to the body. And when he wakes up from being drunk, he just decides to burn his house down, believing his uncle in there, and he moves on with his life. He heads into the city to find the school teacher Rayber. His uncle had tasked him with baptizing Rayber's son, who has an intellectual disability, what would be regarded as the time as mental retardation. And so Francis' uncle was saying, either I'll baptize this child in my time, or you'll do it after I'm dead. It's your responsibility. And so that's partially why Francis tracks down Rayber, but also he needs a place to live because he's just a teenager at this point. And Rayber allows him to to move in, believing that he can finally deprogram Francis from this religious nonsense that his uncle has been preaching, and sort of introduce him to the secular life. Unfortunately, Francis objects to this at every instance. He doesn't want to be beholden to Rayber, so he kind of rejects anything that he really offers. Doesn't really eat or try to hang out with them, and he Francis seems to actively despise Bishop, who is Rayber's intellectually disabled son. And even though he doesn't really subscribe to his uncle's sort of religious beliefs anymore that much, Francis still feels that desire to baptize Bishop. Because that seems like the natural thing to do after everything that he's been taught. And Rayber sees this inner conflict, and so he goes on a fishing trip with Bishop and Francis to really sort of confront all of these things that are going on in Francis. And Rayber reveals that he tried to drown Bishop at one point because he didn't believe that Bishop deserved life or something like that he was kind of ashamed that he was raising this kind of child alone after his wife had left. And so there's a lot going on for Rayber, and he also seems to be trying to escape that programming that his uncle, or that is his real uncle, who was the great uncle of Francis there, was trying to instill on him as well. And during the fishing trip, Rayber reaches out and says, "I know you're going through this. If you continue to feel this way, you're going to grow up a freak who's under the thumb of his uncle. So you have two choices. The first choice is you can try to baptize Bishop and realize how empty that is, and keep trying to seek that feeling out by going along with what your uncle, or what the uncle had really wanted him to believe, or he can try get it out of his system now and move on, or not even try it at all. Realize that the baptism is an empty motion, and that you can't really change or be born anew unless you take action, which isn't really possible for Bishop at this point. So he gives Francis this option, and Francis takes Bishop out on a boat, and Rayber's like, "Oh, this he'll get it out of his system at this point." Unfortunately, Francis decides to drown Bishop, so he engages in two different actions there, because he also tries to baptize him while he's drowning him, and he tries to drown Bishop, indicating that he's not beholden to that religious life that his uncle wanted for him. And so Francis at that point decides to run away, realizing that the hollow nature of the baptism itself, because it certainly didn't get Bishop any closer to God. The drowning technically did that. But he hitchhikes home feeling an immense immense guilt and a growing hunger in his stomach that isn't satisfied by food. One of the people who helps him hitchhike home gives him alcohol, which drugs him, knocks him out, and Francis wakes up in the forest or the woods without his clothes, insinuating that a rape has taken place there. And Francis responds by going into a rage and burning down the woods around him, and as he marches back to his uncle's home that he originally burnt down. He finds out when he gets there that one of the black family helpers actually took the uncle out of the house before Francis burnt it down, and buried him with a cross and everything, what the uncle wanted. And I think at that point Francis's mind kind of breaks, where he realizes that his uncle got what he had wanted this entire time, both the sort of baptism and the burial. And Francis sort of goes through a religious devotion kind of moment. And as the story comes to a close, it notes that he's marching towards the city to preach to God's children. Now, whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's something we're talking about in the analysis section, but that's where it ends there. In terms of analysis, The Violent Bear It Away is quite a doozy of a story. Flannery O'Connor has a lot to say. This is a story that can be taken apart potentially line by line or paragraph by paragraph, and there's much to think about it, because as I just mentioned, like, Flannery O'Connor has a lot to say, particularly about religion. You know, she didn't write a lot in her life, but what she did write is incredibly dense and sometimes hard to decipher as well. But one of the themes, or the main theme really, that Flannery O'Connor is working with here is that of religion. It's enmeshed in the entire story. It's part of the title itself, because there's the title refers to Matthew 11:12, I believe, that where it says, "From the time of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth great violence, and the violent bear it away." Now, what exactly does that mean? That's open to interpretation there. You can interpret it in a couple different ways. I think one way is that the kingdom of heaven is attacked by violent people, or violent people advocate on behalf of heaven, and so those violent people get control of the message of heaven. Whereas if you're passive about things, you wouldn't necessarily be able to spread the message of God. If you're just one of those casual believers, only the most ardent, feverish believers are going to spread the word of God, and you're going to hear the most ardent, heavy-handed message right there. The other explanation is an alternative sort of reading of that line, where it's like the kingdom of heaven is under siege, and the forceful men will take control of it. Again, kind of indicating that people who are out there about religion are going to be spreading that message of heaven, and only by spreading the message of heaven will you be able to enter paradise, perhaps. I think this is a very much in like part of the overall message of the story, but very much in line with some aspect that makes it hard to really decipher what the inherent meaning is. It's very much open to interpretation. But you also see this religion in other areas with the baptism that takes place, the central conflict of the story of whether or not Francis wants or can do the baptism. The idea of being a prophet, which the uncle wants for Francis, and Francis absolutely doesn't want. He's kind of the unwilling prophet in this story. And then the talk of the coming of Jesus, the return of Jesus. Even Rayber's son, his name is Bishop, a very kind of religious name there. So you can't really escape religion throughout this entire story. But when the coming of Jesus is mentioned, it's mentioned in a very violent way. And with Flannery O'Connor, with the story, she's depicting God in one of the most violent means possible. Sort of talking about how God is coming and he will strike down the non-believers, and Jesus will return and wage war. And if you are not with Jesus right now, he will not carry you into heaven after he returns. Sort of talking about Judgment Day and the fires of hell and all of that. And it's essentially preaching through fear. That's what the uncle does in the story. As he's talking to Francis, he portrays heaven and hell as these violent places, and that will one day wage war with one another. Maybe that's part of the heritage of the South right there, and in what kind of religion they were talking about over hundreds of years. But with that violent depiction of God, this isn't a God that's loving or forgiving or who's really on your side. It's sort of an uncaring, forceful God that strikes down his enemies and isn't willing to damn people to hell if they get out of line. Sort of like an uncaring father figure, which Francis doesn't really have in his story. He doesn't have a father figure at all, because his uncle was a very mean, kind of distant person, and so maybe that's what attracts him to religion and God in this story. But as I think Lucas mentioned in our video about Andrei Rublev, if you saw this depiction of God and Jesus, would you want to believe in that person? Would you feel comfortable going to that church or something like that? And maybe that creates some doubt. And indeed, that's another part of the story, is that religious doubt, that questioning of whether you want to go into the life that the uncle has sort of promised to you, has sort of said that you will follow into. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in the stories that people are telling you? This happens to Francis in the story because he sneaks out one night and Rayber follows him and sees him go into a church where he listens to a young woman sort of preach about God in a violent way. When Francis comes out, Rayber confronts him, and Francis says, I don't really believe that. I just wanted to spit on it, suggesting again that he's dealing with all these doubts. There's a good quote that I would like to read to you from this. "All right," the stranger said, "I suppose you know what one of them is, but there's a heap else you don't know. You go ahead and put your feet in his shoes. Elisha after Elijah, like he said. But just let me ask you this. Where is the voice of the Lord? I haven't heard it. Who's called you this morning, or any morning? Have you been told what to do? You ain't even heard the sound of natural thunder this morning. There ain't a cloud in the sky. The trouble with you, I see, he concluded, is that you ain't got but just enough sense to believe every word he told you. And that's the voice that Francis is hearing in his head after his uncle dies, showing the doubts, the concern, the anger and frustration that he's feeling, of feeling like he was conned by his uncle his whole life. But that raises another question: is what is this voice? And I think there's again multiple interpretations. One of them is the devil sort of trying to sway Francis on the wrong path so that he'll be damned to hell. I think that's a little too obvious in this story. Anytime you use like death or the devil as an explanation, it's like it feels a little ham-fisted at times. But here I think that the voice is his own like self-conscious, or not self-conscious, but his own consciousness, his own inner monologue, which he hasn't really listened to his whole life. He's really heard the voice of his uncle the whole life. So this is the first time after his uncle dies that he's really listening to himself, and he's going through a lot of doubt, as any teenager would, of like, what is the true story? Like, what am I supposed to believe? How am I supposed to go through this belief of God and whatnot when I haven't had anything sturdy to lean on? So there's quite a lot of that religious doubt going on in this story, which I love how Flannery O'Connor displays here. There's also talks of fate, destiny, and free will. It seems like Flannery O'Connor is arguing that Francis is headed down a path that he's destined on, that he has no control over, of going down this path where he's going to try to baptize Bishop. And it seems like he has no control over this. He's trying to fight it at every turn, but ultimately your genes, your destiny, your whatever fate, whatever you prefer to call it, decides that this will be the path for you. There's no way to get around it. Ever since he was kidnapped by his uncle at a very young age, this is the path that he was set down upon, that he has no control of getting off of. And his inner struggle, the conflict of the story is him fighting against fate. And it suggests that there is no free will, that we're all set down a path due to unforeseen events or our own genes, and we're destined to deal with hardship because of it, depending on how that fate and free will decides to treat us. And it doesn't help that it seems like madness, some sort of mental illness, is in the genes of the family that led the uncle to be in an asylum for a couple of years, that led it to be sort of passed down through the family. And both Rayber and Francis are sort of dealing with this conflict, this struggle to defy the genes, to defy what is being passed down to them. As I mentioned before, there is an inner struggle in this story. Francis is dealing with this burden that's placed on him by the delusional uncle. And I choose to call him delusional because it's clear he's not an actual prophet. And I don't think Flannery O'Connor believes that he's a prophet either. He's just a delusional man who frequently kidnaps children in an effort to provide more meaning for his life. And because of this, which I think Francis recognizes, because of this, there's a lot of anger towards both the uncle and Rayber. There's anger towards the uncle because, of course, he kidnapped him and sold him a bill of goods on a world that doesn't actually exist. He didn't prepare him for the world at all. He merely taught him how to be a religious person, which doesn't really put him in tune with much of society. And on the other hand, Rayber didn't really do much to try to get him back after he was kidnapped in the first place. The uncle shot at him, which helps explain it, but I think Francis feels that Rayber should have died for him in some regard, that he should have been willing to just put his life on the line to rescue this child from this obviously devoted fanatic of religion over here. And there's also that anger over Rayber trying to secularize him, of basically saying the way that you brought up everything about you is wrong and you're a freak, which I think Rayber says at least at one point, noting like if you don't get rid of this sort of mindset, you're always going to be a freak. And so there's that anger and frustration over these two, how they haven't really prepared him for the best life, and it's produced sort of a war-torn feeling of never knowing which decision to make. Allow me to read you another interesting quote from this. The boy did not care how other nationalities ate. He had always left the restaurants hungry, conscious of an intrusion in his works. Since the breakfast he had finished sitting in the presence of his uncle's corpse, he had not been satisfied by food, and his hunger had become like an insistent silent force inside him, a silence inside akin to the silence outside, as if the grand trap left him barely an inch to move in, barely an inch in which to keep himself inviolate. And there you see the inner conflict that he's dealing with, of not really knowing like which side to really engage in there, of struggling and not being able to eat and not really being able to find answers for everything that kind of pains him, and the world doesn't seem equipped to give him the answers that he's looking for. There's a question of what he can do with Bishop. Like, he can either baptize him or he can choose not to baptize him, and again, he doesn't really know what he's going to do, and ultimately he decides to kind of do both, which results in Bishop drowning and him trying to baptize a child, and then realizing that the baptism means nothing if you don't change your life, that it's merely a symbolic gesture, meaningless if you don't intend to adopt the principles of that religion in the process. So drowning him kind of fills him with even more anguish and guilt and frustration. And at the end of the story, you get a sort of an ambiguous ending where Francis has been filled with so much rage and confusion and frustration that his mind breaks and he sort of adopts the patterns of his uncle. It suggests two different things could be happening in this story, because it says that he's on his way towards the city to preach to God's children, but he's filled with so much rage that one interpretation could be that he's going to kill God's children, that this has turned him into something of a violent murderer, and that whatever comes next is akin to psychopathy, sociopathy, whatever you choose to call it. That it's not a good for him. And the other ending is not more positive. It suggests that he's going to follow in his uncle's footsteps and preach and become this prophet that he thinks he was destined to be. Realizing that he can't defy his uncle any longer since he got the grave that he was looking for, and that he's finally going to preach and be the violent that bear it away in this story, which is equally depressing. But I think that's more likely in this story. But him engaging in great violence on God's people as a way to get revenge or something also seems likely somewhat. But another interesting thing, and I know I'm going on and on in this video, is the desire to need to be called, which Rayber actually attributes to the uncle in this story. Rayber says that the uncle has a great need to be called, and so he called himself. He declared himself a prophet because his mental state decided that he needed that in order to maybe provide meaning or something like that. And that is also happening to Francis in this story. At the end of the story, he's so lost and kind of broken that he needs to be called, and you see him kind of calling himself in order to sort of make sense of things. I don't think it's going to help. I think this is going to create more problems down the road for Francis, but I don't think there's any avenue for him to really have a happy ending at this point. Unfortunately, he's been so torn, and he's had a lack of guidance that it's kind of game over for him. There are other interesting things about this story. It kind of begins and ends with fire, because at the beginning he burns down his uncle's home, and at the end of the story he kind of sets fire to both the estate as well as the woods around him because of the fury that he feels. So it's just interesting how the story's kind of symmetrical in that regard. And then I also like the character of Rayber, as he is a kind of a reflection of Francis. Even though he's chosen the secular life, Francis notes that they're really no different than one another, because Francis is kind of lost, but Rayber also is lost, but he's invested himself in school teaching. He's invested himself in his son, which he doesn't really love, to be honest, and he's chosen all those things to get rid of the feeling of loneliness and madness and the call towards whatever religious passion he's apparently feeling. So they're very similar to one another, and they even note that like Francis is like, oh, you're no different than me. I have things figured out, and you're still way lost in the sea. But Francis doesn't have, neither of them have things figured out, and they're both completely lost, and the story ends on a very negative note for the both of them. And there's a couple things that I don't like in this story. One of them is the breakneck transition from the past to the present throughout the story, even in the same paragraph, because sometimes the story will go from the present straight to the past within the same paragraph, focusing on the uncle's relationship with Francis, to provide, I guess, a little bit more context. But the speed at which Flannery O'Connor does that makes it sometimes hard to follow along with where exactly we are in the timeline there, and then it can also be hard to decipher. Partially due to the breakneck speed of the transitions, but also because it's very, very strongly entrenched in this religious symbolism, in this sort of religious iconism or something, just in religious storytelling, which if you don't have a degree in theology or anything like that, it's going to make it really hard to understand what exactly Flannery O'Connor is getting at. That doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. It's just for the average person, they might not be able to understand exactly what Flannery O'Connor is getting at. There's some parts that I don't even understand, and I've read some of Flannery's other work. But what's also interesting is when I had watched The Banshees of Inisherin, a movie that came out last year. And when I saw someone comment on Twitter that it's a great movie, but the only person who really understands its true meaning is the guy who made it, because it seems like he's talking about something about his Irish upbringing and stuff to do that only the people of Ireland might truly comprehend. And I feel like that's happening here as well. Flannery O'Connor is talking about her religion, what God means to her, and how she perceives religion to be, and how one should act in their religion, all those kinds of things. And it's something that only makes sense if you ask her about it, or if she gives you some insight into her beliefs, which, it's too late to really ask about that now because she's dead. And so I feel like a lot of the meaning of The Violent Buried Away has kind of been lost, unless she wrote about it elsewhere. But it's hard to decipher because it's so much focused on Flannery O'Connor's own upbringing and whatnot. Anyway, those are my many thoughts on The Violent Buried Away by Flannery O'Connor. A pretty solid book. Definitely one of the more memorable books that I've read for this channel. Super depressing as well, as Francis's story does not end on a positive note. Indeed, no character truly thrives in this story. It's kind of a wreck all around. I do recommend it to you out there, but I will add a caveat that it can be hard to decipher. And Flannery O'Connor's writing might be hard to get into, so maybe you should check out some of her other work, maybe her short stories, before you get into this. But I do think it's a quality read that will leave you thinking for quite some time. If you read it before, or you simply want to comment on my review here, do so below. I would love to have a discussion with you about The Violent Buried Away. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book or this author if they don't already know. Otherwise, join the Discord if you want to talk more about books or movies or TV or whatever it is you want to talk about. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and prophetic travels. Farewell.